Welcome to the Storytelling That Sells podcast. Thank you so much for joining me here, episode 2. And we are going to be launching this whole thing today. And when I say we, I do mean my co-host and I, Melissa Page. Unfortunately, Melissa was not available to be with us today physically. So I'm launching this on her behalf. And I'm not sure how often Melissa's going to be able to join us, but I'm hoping at least twice a month. That would be great. I know it's a burden on her. She's got a lot on her plate. But Melissa and I both consider this podcast an important endeavor because we both believe in the power of storytelling. And I'm going to be talking for as long as you guys will be supporting me about the many ways that stories sell. And when I use the word sell, I don't always mean that they sell a product or service that is a financial goal. Sometimes we're selling concepts. Sometimes parents are selling children on the importance of following a behavior. Sometimes executives are selling employees on a way to conduct themselves in a business. And storytelling that sells is all about that and probably a whole lot more. And I could give you a really quick example of sort of the financial part of it. And this happened to me very early on in my professional career. I was an airline editor for a publication called Business Travel News. And I was flying back from the West Coast. It was a evening flight on a Friday, and there was a gentleman sitting next to me. And I could tell almost immediately that he was going to be occupying quite a bit of that 4.5, 5-hour flight home. And this fellow was a salesperson who sold GPS to bus companies. And the whole concept that his company had was for bus dispatchers and bus departments at school districts, they could save money and make their bus routes more efficient if they bought his product. Because he was flying to New Jersey on a Friday to go see his girlfriend. And the reason why he regularly flew on this long distance relationship was because he was cleaning up at this company that he worked for. And he was so proud of it that that's why he wanted to engage with me in a conversation. And basically what he did to explain what he did for a living, here we are sitting in his airplane, it's darkened, we're heading back to the East Coast. And he starts telling me how he stumbled upon the sales tool that changed his life forever. And what he did was he started selling in a way that was features and benefits. But he said at one point, he realized he wasn't breaking through to these dispatchers. These were not people who normally got to make decisions about purchasing something like GPS, and how much it cost back then, I have no idea. But anyway, it was a big enough expense that the people that he was speaking to weren't getting it. So then he said to himself, I wonder what their biggest problem is, which anybody here who's a salesperson or has ever sold, solution selling is the way to go. That is the quickest way to close a sale, is to find out the pain points of the other individual and jump in with ways that hopefully your product can solve that. And in many, many years in sales and marketing in my career, that has always been the number one way for me to succeed. So this guy is talking about how one day he just found a very amenable dispatcher. And this guy said, you know what my biggest problem is? He said, I think my drivers are sandbagging it. I think when they go out in the mornings, they're sitting somewhere having a cup of coffee with the bus running, chit-chatting with each other. He said, and I think we're losing tons of money in gas. And I don't think we need as many drivers as we have because I don't think these routes are efficient. And it dawned on my friend, the salesperson flying to see his girlfriend in New Jersey. Well, guess what? That's why I'm here. This little device is going to track your drivers over time, and you will be able to tell when they're idling. You'll be able to tell if routes are efficient and whether or not it really takes that amount of time to pick up that number of school kids. And he closes the sale with this individual, and now he starts telling that story to every single sales prospect in his territory, and he starts racking up the sales. And here I am sitting on an airplane covering the travel industry, a storyteller myself. And it still didn't dawn on me that what I did and what he did wasn't all that different. that the neuroscience, which has been studied intently, that storytelling sells better than any other way of communicating. And so that is what this whole endeavor is going to be about. I am going to be hopefully bringing to you examples of great storytelling. I will be providing you tips and tricks about great storytelling. And we are going to be inviting some amazing storytellers already out there doing a great job. If you do have someone who you'd like to recommend for this podcast, please have them email me at rich@richardambrosio.com, and I'll spell that for you. So it's Richard, my full name, DAMBROSIO.com. Please send me those suggestions. If you want to drop a comment on our YouTube page, in the comments section, feel free to nominate people there. And definitely use the comment section in the YouTube page to ask questions, to suggest topics. This is supposed to be a conversation. This is about us telling stories together. And I don't want to be talking at you all that often, which is why I like having a co-host and which is why I like having interview subjects. But, stories like the gentleman's story that I just told you, they also vary in consequences. And it is important that we attempt to achieve our goals regardless of what the consequences are. So for this gentleman, the consequences were he had the wherewithal to have a girlfriend who lived 3,000 miles away, and he was buying nice things for himself and he was buying nice things for her. Other times, the storytelling needs that we have as a society have dire consequences. Here we are in the spring of 2022, and the stories that are unfolding in the Ukraine, where we are seeing stories of butchery. We are seeing stories of communities being laid to waste, of soldiers performing the most heinous sexual crimes against women, including the story of the president of the Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, who was a comedian of all things and a dancer on some European dance-off contest on television. And now this man is perhaps the most idolized leader in the world. And then, of course, there's the leader of Russia. And of course, his story is perhaps the classic Macbeth story, that he has gotten too ambitious and he has fallen too far from some reasonable ruler-like character traits to a man that, as far as we can tell, has taken on horrific ways of living his life and imposing his anger and fear and bitterness and racism and incredible callousness towards human life. There's another story that's unfolding, and those consequences are extremely dire. Closer to home, the entire United States is going through a story together. It's the COVID-19 story. And what I was going to focus on today, since we don't have an interview subject, is I wanted to examine the COVID-19 story and how perhaps the failure of a number of populations to articulate COVID-19, its biology, its virology, its potential impact on human beings, how not telling that story in a way that human beings could digest it, and both in a factual manner, but also in a logical manner, and maybe, predominantly an emotional manner, make decisions to protect themselves, their loved ones, and their community. And I believe that it's been an utter failure on just about everybody's part. I think at the very least, a couple of 100,000 people have probably died, perhaps unnecessarily, because they didn't really understand the virus. They didn't understand the risk to themselves and to others. And as a result, they conducted their lives in a way that ended up in death. And God only knows how many people will have some kind of permanent damage to their bodies as we start to understand what long COVID looks like. Without dwelling too much, let's get back to storytelling. So what we've seen is that COVID, of course, is not a simplistic thing to describe to people. At the very beginning, we had, the WHO was saying, we don't believe this is aerosolized, which ended up not being true. We had people scrubbing down their groceries because of the way that COVID could sit on a surface of some kind, and whether or not we were all touching things and then touching our eyes and our mouth and giving ourselves COVID. Of course, over time, what we found out is that contracting COVID via surface infection is probably very, very low. And that, of course, the risk is somebody sneezes, speaks, articulates droplets out of their mouth. And as a result, it's sitting in the air and the droplets aren't so heavy that they don't fall very quickly. And you now walk into the path of a dense enough amount of those droplets and you contract COVID. And so that kind of is the understanding of how COVID, for the most part, infects us. And depending upon the viral load, whether or not we're going to end up in the hospital, depending upon our predisposition from other comorbidities, how perhaps we are more vulnerable to a worse case of COVID than others. Certainly age is a high determinant to that. And then, of course, the worst part is that so many, over 1 million now in the United States, have died from COVID. That story is a very complex one, and there are so many variables in that journey from someone having droplets inside them, articulating them out into the air, and where that environment is and who is ingesting it. That is such a complex piece of facts. And over time, those facts have changed. So this is not a simplistic story to tell. So even from the get-go, this was never going to be an easy thing for people to communicate, but it got worse from the beginning because it was highly politicized by a large group of people. This was not about science. This very quickly became about, are you blue? Are you red? Are you purple? In terms of your political persuasion. And now even facts weren't necessarily a part of a story. We all know the facts of Star Wars, right? We know that Princess Leia gets arrested at the very beginning. And we know that there's this guy named Darth Vader who works for this evil empire. And we understand that there's someone out there who can save that universe. We understand those facts. We learn more facts as it proceeds, as the story develops. And as a result, it's a fairly simplistic hero's journey. That is not COVID, because again, me stepping into an indoor environment today with both I'm double vaccinated and boosted. If I had been this person 2 years ago and not been obviously vaxxed and boosted, because vaccines only became available in 2021, and I walked into that same environment, I was in tremendous jeopardy, especially if there were quite a few people in that room spitting out tons of droplets. And so now you've got people having to understand not just what their experience was in 2020 and 2021, but now here in 2022, where we've also got a high incidence of people who may have some protection from having been infected by COVID, even though they've never been vaccinated. We've got this melange of factors, which now makes the story even more complex. It'd be like telling people in the middle of Star Wars that, the Force only works on Fridays or something, or that we learned that the Force depreciates over time. And now you'd be confused about, is Luke really powerful enough to fly that cruiser into the heart of the Death Star and know exactly when to press the button to destroy it? You'd be like totally whacked out about all of this. But that doesn't let off the public policy leaders out there and the many mistakes that they repeatedly made over time to tell us about COVID more as a story that we could understand, like we were sitting in a cinema watching it on a movie screen, or having a novel written about COVID and reading the book and being able to put it down and say, okay, I understand the characters. I understand the plot line so far. I understand how the rising tension is happening. And I know we're going to reach a climax at some point, but I understand this is not a simple story. Nobody's ever done that, really. And the media hasn't helped any better, because the media is focused on headlines. They're focused on today's news. People's attention spans are short. And as a result, the media tends to focus on a very pinpoint basis. This is what cases look like today. And now I'm going to put a scene on the streets of your city that, somehow align with that headline. And you've got only today's image. You have no context about what today looks like and why perhaps today's message contradicts the message you received last week or a month ago. There is no ongoing contribution of characters and dialogue and events that help you understand, okay, COVID changes over time. Depending upon what the current facts are, here's how I evaluate my risk. So today, back in March, April of 2020, cases were very important to the media and should have been important to us, because without any vaccines, without a high incidence of infection, we had a lot of people walking around who weren't building the antibodies, the immunity to fight the droplets carrying the virus coming inside our lungs. We didn't have it. So cases were important. But over time, especially after sort of April, May of 2021, when vaccines were widely available, when we were starting to see a very large portion of the country contracting COVID and recovering from it, cases should have become a lot less important to us. And what we should have been doing was holding public policy leaders and anybody else attached to COVID reporting to telling us better stories over time. So for example, during the summer of 2021, there was the Lollapalooza concert in Chicago. The city of Chicago's Department of Health worked with the concert organizers to require attendees to only come if they had vaccinations. There was some pretty thorough reporting and testing going on at the time. Back then, we had a fairly accurate assessment of how many people leaving Lollapalooza had COVID. And the incidence rate was fairly low. And if you actually looked at the incidence rate of attendees compared to the rest of the country, and there were quite a few hotspots that summer because this was the tail end of Delta, you know what? If you had attended Lollapalooza and you were fairly conservative in your behaviors and you weren't going back to a state where there was a high incidence, where you might have contracted it there instead of at the concert, you know what? The story was, we can manage outdoor events, even with a bunch of screaming, crazy young people at a concert cheering and yelling and kind of drunk and probably not exactly, keeping their faces covered and social distancing. That was I would say, a moderate success. And that was the story coming out of Lollapalooza. At the same time, we had a Carnival cruise ship from New Orleans, went out into the Caribbean, and there was a big blowout about how the ship had passengers who had COVID. It was going to the Western Caribbean, and I believe they had to report their cases to the port. And as a result, that got disclosed somehow to the public. And there's a tort lawyer in Florida who published some news about this on his website and then started to feed, news coverage about it. And one of the cases was a grandmother from Oklahoma, and she passed away. So the media jumped all over it, but they never did what Chicago did. They never looked at the number of passengers and crew on that ship and gave you an idea of what the incidence rate was on that ship. Because if thousands of people were on that ship and the percentage of people who got infected was below generally what the United States was, or at par even, then to some degree, what that tells me was that people were abiding by the protocols that Carnival had for boarding the ship, that the percentage of cabins that were filled, that they were allowed to fill, was an okay number, that the social distancing or other protocols on board were fairly effective because it wasn't a super spreader event to the best of our knowledge. Unfortunately, we have done a horrible job in public health here in the United States, having a rigid control over those facts. And we have a very sort of privacy-oriented society, and we have the politics of COVID. So who knows if some people didn't report that they had it. Because we handled this so loosely, we've never even had the factual data to tell a full story about whether outdoor concerts can be held safely, whether or not elderly people can go on a cruise ship and relatively ensure themselves that they will come home okay. We haven't done that job. And I put that failure on the public policy leaders. I put it on a society that's overly politicized, and I put it on a media that was ridiculously focused on the number of cases on a ship at a time when vaccinations were widely available, where protocols were in place, and we were testing them in some cases, and things seemed to be working. So there has to be an allowance for a certain level of cases. And I hate to say it this way, but it's the truth. There has to be an allowance for the risk of hospitalization and death. We take the same risks for hospitalizations and deaths every time we get in our automobile, put the key in the ignition, and go for a drive. We do know that there are certain percentage of people who are going to do that every day. And because of whatever, road conditions, negligence on the part of a driver, just a complete accident, an unfortunate set of circumstances will cause some people to be hospitalized and others to pass away. And there are variable factors involved. Speed, which kind of vehicles were in the accident? What was the individual's health? Was there something else that the accident triggered and caused the person to die? And we kind of understand those stories because we've been living with the story of automobiles and accidents for a long time, and we kind of understand that risk. We've never really done that with COVID the same way. And as I think about storytelling that sells, that is a critical way for us to deal with these kinds of pandemics and endemics. And I don't see us getting any better about it. I mean, I still see public policy people, including people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who I'm in total awe of, and I respect the man tremendously. I think he's done a yeoman's job trying to navigate this complexity, not to mention the politics of the previous administration and how that hampered him at times and hampered the CDC. But anyway, even Fauci has screwed up. He has said things sometimes in interviews in such a blithe way that he's left people more confused. Back in, I think it was March, he talked about, or April, he talked about how we're coming out of the full-blown pandemic. Well, what does that mean? And give us some context as you tell us something like that. Because if that's the sentence that the editors and the headline writers are going to grab onto, you're taking a risk at that being abbreviated. And now all of a sudden, the story is we're coming out of a full-blown pandemic. So, we've got all of this going on and we're still no better at it. And I really do believe that storytelling works. I think people understand things when you tell them a situation in a narrative. And we have seen so many narratives throughout COVID, narratives of what happened in New York City. We had something like 20,000 deaths or something like that in the first sort of 2 to 3 months of COVID. And ever since then, New York City has done a pretty good job of leveling that out through social distancing, through masking rules, through protocols on mass transit. So if someone was to take a look today at the CDC's report of the number of people who've died in the state of New York, you might look at it and say, wow, New York's done a horrible job. Well, no. At the beginning of COVID, when we had no idea how this was transmitted, when we knew very little about how to take care of people. So hospitals were overwhelmed and they didn't understand how this was being transmitted within a hospital. They were limited in their staffing because they were so overwhelmed. So therefore, some people were getting poor care and perhaps dying a lot faster. Certainly, with more asymptomatic transmission back then because testing wasn't that widely available. Perhaps more people were walking around with it, giving it to each other in higher viral loads. So people were showing up at the hospital with the worst case scenario. So, yes. And so what you ended up with is a story that actually says by studying COVID, by applying the right levers to reduce transmission and increase survival rates in hospitals, New York's done a pretty damn good job. And I would say to you that any state that has seen worse cases long after that, first 6 months, there's a different story going on there because they had the access to the same scientific studies. They had the ability to read the newspaper stories, call the hospital administrators, call the doctors and epidemiologists and virologists who were working on all this and studying what happened in New York. And they chose not to make the same choices that New York City and New York State did to try to keep COVID down. And therefore, that is a very instructive narrative about having facts and choosing not to either agree to them or employ them in your decision making. Now, did New York State make other mistakes? Absolutely. Previous governor, I was not a big fan of his, and it is proven now that his decision to send people back to elderly care facilities was a bad choice. His hiding the level that the deaths happened in those facilities is certainly a heinous thing to do. You don't hide from your mistakes, you try to deal with them. And so, there's a host of other stories that we could still learn from and not politicize to protect people, which ultimately is the end of the story we all want. I don't care what your political persuasion is. I want you alive. I don't care what your political persuasion is. I don't want you overwhelming our healthcare workers. I don't want you getting sick and potentially having long-term problems with your health. I don't care if you're blue or red or purple or whatever. The end of my story, the story that I think most of us want, because we're all decent people in the end, I think, is to limit the impact from COVID, the negative impact. And so, you look at these stories and you ask yourself, A, did we really tell good stories that people could understand? B, what have we learned from these stories and how do we tell better ones? And what are we going to do with this now? And I got to tell you, something happened recently. There was another Carnival Cruise Line incident. The Carnival Spirit was docked in Seattle, and a report came out on Saturday, May the 7th, about how there was an outbreak on board. And what are we doing to provide facts about what happened? Well, the CDC is saying we're not allowed to tell you how many people on board were sick. Why? And I don't see any reporter challenging on that. If we say X percent of people were positive on COVID, how is that going to violate anybody's privacy? If there's thousands of people on board, you know what? It's something we can manage without hurting that individual. We found out that there were some people, because guess what? In today's age of having a smartphone in your hand, you can text your family, hey, I'm stuck on a ship, I got COVID. You can contact the news if you're pissed off that a supplier, a travel supplier, isn't, in your estimation, taking care of you properly. And you're finally so angry that you reach out to the news media and say, hey, I'm COVID positive and I'm quarantined on this ship and I'm being treated lousy. No matter what, other people are creating stories out there about COVID. And if public policy leaders and corporations think that they can hide these stories from happening, they may be able to reduce the number of people who learn about those stories. They may be able to make those stories have a shorter shelf life, especially if things work out okay and nobody gets hospitalized, nobody dies, it's not a super spreader event. Yes, that will fall off the headlines and your brand will have to deal with it at a lower intensity level. But we undermine the public's trust in all of us. We create uncertainty, we create anxiety, because they can still find this stuff on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. Like I said, if it does get leaked to the press, they're going to see those press stories appearing in their news feed on Facebook. It's not like we can just tamp all of this down. I mean, Russia is trying to tamp down the truth about their invasion of the Ukraine. And what are Russians doing? They're downloading VPN software by the tens of thousands. And they are logging into social media and they're finding out the facts about the invasion of the Ukraine. We live in a much more open society here in the United States. Information is much more readily available. And if we think that by handing the telling of these stories off to random people on ships or in hotels or stuck on islands and resorts, if we think that just leaving it to them to tell our story is the best idea, I'm pretty sure that's not a good idea. And I follow quite a few sentiment indexes. And I also follow a lot of data in the travel industry because a lot of my consulting is in the travel industry. And here's what I can tell you. The anxiety level about traveling and getting COVID, while it's at a really all-time low, it's stalled a little bit. And it may be because the news has not been great lately, or not that it's not been great, but that coronavirus cases are being reported to go up all over. And we are starting to see, more chatter about that. So as I sort of move out of the interview section of Storytelling That Sells, the podcast, and I'm combining it this time with news about stories and storytelling, as I kind of wrap up this section of the podcast, I'd like to give you some tips and advice, especially if you are in public policy in some respect if you are a PR person, if you are a senior leader of a company that could find yourself in the middle of a COVID news event of some kind, own the story, even if it isn't pretty. Don't think that you can shy away from a story. We have seen so many stories about different companies that force people back to work at the beginning of COVID. We saw this a lot out in the Midwest with some of our produce companies, the companies that process our food, because we needed people doing that. And these companies weren't doing a great job protecting those people. And there were quite a few stories in the press about factories where employees were being treated horribly. And so if those corporations thought that that news wasn't going to get out to the industry and besmirch their brand, boy, what a mistake that was. So if you're in a position of having to make a decision about, do we communicate about this COVID incident? My tip to you is do it. It's the old, analogy, rip the Band-Aid off instead of pulling it slowly, which will eventually hurt more and for a longer period of time. Storytelling is not the perfect salve for every problem we have, but being open and honest, telling stories genuinely and authentically over the long term will enrich your brand versus hurt it. And I definitely think that that is one of the things that we have done poorly as a country, as corporate executives, as state leaders, county leaders, public policy representatives. I would say the overwhelming majority of us have chosen to try to hide COVID, as our governor here in New York did at the very beginning, when it was a story of, oh my God, I made a decision that put tons of elderly people, someone's grandmother or someone's grandfather, I put them at risk with my decision, and I don't want to own it. That rarely goes well. Those don't tend to lead to happy endings for those stories. Tip number 2, we need to learn that stories need to be told with some context. We need to tell stories in a way that people can understand, especially when it comes to something complex, that this is not a simplistic story. This is not a fairy tale. Life is rarely that simple. And we have to figure out ways to translate complex topics into storylines that significant, I'm not going to say a majority, because who knows what percentage of any population is willing to accept a concept. But we need to be able to tell stories that a significant portion of our population can absorb and understand. Even if they don't understand it perfectly, they get the gist of it and they know how to make decisions that are more appropriate for them to protect them and their loved ones in their community. We've got to learn how to put that context on. Tip number 3, repeat, repeat, repeat. There is a reason why certain television stations, the news channels, sort of grab onto a mantra and just pound away at it, because they know if you missed it this morning at 11, but you're here at 5 o'clock while you're cooking dinner and you hear my message about the other party or the other thing that I want to point a finger at or whatever it is. And then you hear it again at 9 o'clock after the kids go to bed. And then you hear it 2 days later. And then you hear it 4 days later. And then you hear it for 3 occasions on Sunday during the morning news shows. Guess what? Repetition tends to help people absorb something more factually over time. So repetition is a good thing. And then finally, what I'd love to do is see all of us telling stories at a level that people can understand. Take the jargon out of your press conferences and your press releases. Teach your spokespeople how to say something at a macro level and then say, let me just give you an example to what I just said. There was this couple out in California who Googled COVID information and came to believe X, Y, and Z. And sure enough, they caught COVID at about the same time, and they died within 24 hours of each other. They never got vaccinated. They didn't believe in COVID as a high-risk thing for them, and as a result, they're dead. That is so much better to do than to say disinformation, misinformation, Googling stuff on COVID is a waste of time. Give people live examples where they can associate perhaps with the characters in that story and say, well, I kind of look like them. I do those things. Am I at risk? If you place people in stories, they're much more likely to perform the behaviors that you want than if you just lecture them about the science and the facts and the tips that you offer. And that particular case I just said actually did happen. There was a very unfortunate incident where a couple died within 24 hours of each other, making their kids orphaned, and it literally killed them. So that's tip number 4. Take the jargon out, bring it down to a real level that people can directly associate with. Hey guys, this is our first podcast. I know I went on a little bit, hoping to keep this down to 30 minutes. We'll see if we can do that. But like I said, the structure of the podcast will be, we'll jump in real quick for a couple of minutes and talk about great examples of storytelling that are in the news right around the time of the podcast. We will have a host of great interview subjects, and I've already started to line those people up for succeeding episodes. And then we'll go into tips and advice toward the end of the podcast, and hopefully wrap it up with a call to action, a denouement of the whole episode where you can understand how to integrate that whole episode into what you do for a living, the way that you persuade others, and maybe even become an interview subject of your own when you deploy it and find that storytelling sells for you. So with that, I'm going to sign off for episode number 2, our first full episode, for what I hope will be a long run of podcasts for you. I hope this added value, and I hope to hear from you soon. We'll be launching a number of ways, including social media, for you to participate over time. Actually, we already have a Facebook page called Storytelling That Sells, and we have an Instagram handle for the same. So if you go on social media, start subscribing, following us, liking us, throwing out comments in the DMs on Instagram, or posting something in the Storytelling That Sells Facebook group. We want this to be a conversation. We want to hear your stories. We want you to be a part of our stories, and we hope we're a part of yours as well. Thanks so much for listening. Take care, and I hope to either be telling or hearing your story very soon.